Well, today on the show, we've got an ambassador for one of my favorite brands. He's a former two-sport college athlete, swimming, baseball. We love athletes on the show. Obviously, that's my background. Master Certified Health Coach, MCHC, through the Institute of Transformational Nutrition. And I think most notably, at least for me, he hosts the Ancestral Wisdom Show. That's on the YouTube channel for this supplement company here, Ancestral Supplements. Huge fan of these guys. They love doing all sorts of stuff by way of health optimization, wellness, science-based approach, but connecting it through this like ancestral lens. Great show. Craig McCloskey, thanks for being on the show, man.
Eddie, thanks for having me, man. I've been excited for this.
Me too. I think where we're going to go with this episode is we want to talk about some of this video that you put out on the 11 dietary principles of the healthiest people on the planet. I think that's going to be where we could like earn our money today. But I just to state it at the top, I think we're chronically unhealthy in the United States. I think you know that. I think we all are kind of seeing that. The standard American diet, it's just not been working if the goal is overall health and if the goal is longevity or if it's well-being. Maybe if it's profit, it's working. But if it's any of those things and us feeling good, it hasn't. So I'd love to pick your brain on that. But first, like, how did you find yourself in this online health and wellness space? Like, how did all this come to be?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I'll summarize it really. I mean, I grew up as an athlete, like you were mentioning. I played two sports, baseball and swimming at my university, a branch campus of Penn State. And I took some time off after college, after high school, excuse me. And I joined the Air Force actually for just a little bit of time. And then I walked on at my university, my athletics there. And I really just had this love for health only through the lens of how can it impact my performance? I didn't really know much outside of health, quote unquote health, really outside of the nutrition and how it can impact my performance. So when I went into Penn State, I was really just learning as much as I could and just trying to take it all in. I thought I maybe wanted to go into the nursing route, but I took a nutrition class and I just fell in love with it. You know, it was really awesome to see how applying certain things could impact or inhibit my performance when I was going to training and things like that. But then really what thrusted me into where I'm at today is in February 19th, I woke up, this is 2015, I woke up, so 10 years ago now, and I was commuting to my local college. My dad comes into my room, I'm 21 years old, and my dad, he has the phone in his hand, tears in his eyes, 6:30 in the morning, and I like immediately something's up, because at 21 years old, your dad doesn't come to wake you up out of your room. And so he shakes me and he looks at me and he just says, "Hey, I got a call from your aunt right now. Your uncle Nathan didn't wake up this morning." And I was like, "What's going on?" And he didn't know. Turns out my uncle, who was 43, he had two kids, young kids under 10. He had a massive heart attack in his sleep and just didn't wake up. And so that he was like a second dad to me, you know? So that was my awakening to how you live your life can impact your health. And so I kind of had this slight depression for a couple months. You know, I'm in college trying to figure things out. So I really wanted to like just learn as much about health that I could. I was already a nutrition major because I loved it, but then I really just kind of got thrust into this. So I started doing more research outside of my university, learning from books and traveling across the country. I mean, to Florida, to California, to DC, to just attend all these live events. And what I learned there in these outside books and events kind of competed with what I was learning in my university as far as nutrition recommendations goes. And so I was at odds end, like what's right, what's wrong. So I really had this beautiful perspective of kind of both ends of the spectrum, if you will, of nutrition and applying things on myself, what was working for me, what wasn't working for me. So really, all in all, that's what really got me into this space that about 10 years ago now was my uncle passing and just trying a bunch of different methods on myself to see what worked and what didn't.
So was it, you sort of going, hey, maybe there's something we can kind of do. We can participate in our own, longevity, our own well-being with looking at some of the diet, the sleep, the food. Was that the impetus for it, or was it just kind of the overall just shock of, oh my gosh, like life is short? Maybe it was both.
All of it, yeah, definitely. I mean, being an athlete, like athletics and movement was kind of at the forefront, but then that nutrition piece, I could see physically. I mean, I would go to the calf and just eat all the ultra processed junk, the French fries, all that fried food. And I was a swimmer at the time, so I was just trying to get my calories in, and it didn't matter. But looking back, I was slightly inflamed. I wasn't reaching my full potential. My joints were hurting. I had some skin issues that I was struggling with. But when I started just eating a more whole food based diet, that's what really kind of changed for me. I was recovering quicker. I wasn't getting injured as much. But yeah, everything else went along with it. The sleep, the stress factor, eliminating environmental toxins, prayer and getting more involved with my family and friends, hanging around better people. That all plays a factor in our health, right? So it just led to one thing after another. I became obsessed with learning about as much health factors that I could.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's shocking to me actually, listening to your story, how many people they could walk through such a tragedy, even with a family member, and kind of not put it all together. They don't put the pieces together and go, oh, maybe there was something we could have done. We say, oh, it's random chance, or there's nothing we could have done about it, and they don't think twice. Or maybe they get so scared or afraid that they just want to kind of bury their head in sand and not kind of try not to think about it.
Yeah. And then the thing with my uncle was he wasn't outwardly unhealthy. I mean, he just looked like an average American, and he was maybe slightly overweight, but no one that you would imagine would pass away at 43 from a heart attack. It just didn't fit the bill. So it was a shock to everybody, and that's what really was the wake up call for me.
Yeah, I lost my mom at a young age, a little different from your uncle in the sense of she was chronically unhealthy in many different ways. And, even as a young teenager, I felt like there was something I needed to do to try to, do my best. I know that I could go at any given moment. I'm not shocked by that. I know there's a lot of longevity guys, I'm going to live to 150 or whatever. I get that. That would be awesome. I'll try. But at the end of the day, there are some things that are within our control. I mean, a lot of these chronic diseases are things that we can, in fact, prevent if we just have some care, which is why we're kind of here today.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to say, die young at a very old age. When I talk about a lot of these things and I show what we do inside our home, whether that's living a non-toxic lifestyle, I sometimes get the comment that people say, well, you're going to die anyways. What's the point in doing all this? And my typical response is, I'm not trying to live to be 120, 150. Whenever my time to go is my time. I'm just trying to live as high quality a life as I can here while I'm on this planet. So that way, when I'm 50 years old, 60 years old, I have the energy, I have good joints, I have the ability to hang out with and play with my kids and my wife and my family. I don't want to be able to not get up off the lazy boy because I'm so tired and unhealthy. That's the goal for me, is to live as high quality a life as I can, not try and extend it as much as I can.
Did you have the image like I did in my head of most older folks, when I was growing up, they kind of did, you mentioned the lazy boy, they kind of just resigned themselves to that couch cushion, and they're like, all right, well, this is where I'm going to be for the next 10 to 20 years or so, and then I kind of just go. Was that something you saw growing up, or maybe just like friends' homes or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, my own home, I grew up, my parents were young, 16, 17 when I was born, so they were young teenagers, and I was raised primarily by both sets of grandparents, my dad's parents and my mom's parents, and I could, on both sides, it was very sedentary. My grandfather, both of them passed within the past 5 years. My grandfather on my dad's side, all my memories with him were just sitting in the lazy boy watching the news and just hanging out. The most amazing guy, he'd do anything for me, but that was just his life. He just liked to hang out in the chair and read the paper. But that was really it. So that was my memories of him.
Yeah. I remember my grandfather doing kind of similar, and he would just kind of sit there. I think people listening probably have similar stories. And, the thing is, like, he didn't go super quick, but you spend 30 years in a chair pretty soon because, people are living a little bit longer. You've got all these advancements, certainly not necessarily like you're talking about quality of life, more like extending those years. But man, you're there, you think you're going to be there for 5 years and you're here for 30. At a certain point you could say, man, I could have spent the last 25, 30 years doing something better with my time.
Yeah. If you don't use it, you lose it in regards to your muscles. So, just go for a daily walk, do a little bit of exercise, and we could talk all about that, like the different types of exercises, but really just getting up and moving your body is one of the best things you can do.
No doubt. All right. So let's say you want you want out of that life. You want to opt out. You're thinking, okay, I don't want the chair for the next 30 years, as I get older. Certainly there's things we could do now. And you put out that video on the 11 dietary principles of the healthiest people on the planet. So what I was thinking we could do is we walk through many of these, and we could just go back and forth on them. And I'd love to get your thoughts and opinions on them. So you have these 11. The first one, I think, is gaining some popularity because of the certain political landscape we find ourselves in with RFK. So first one's no ultra processed foods. So why not?
Yeah. So there's a difference between processed foods and ultra processed foods, in my opinion. For as long as humans have existed, we've always been processing our foods to a certain extent. That's just cooking, that's using fire, that's heating our foods up, that's fermenting our foods into, cabbage into sauerkraut. And processing historically, these cultures, all cultures have processed their foods historically. I mean, just cutting the meat off the bone or, cutting the plant out of the garden, that's a form of processing. And depending on how you process it, can make the food more bioavailable, it can make it safer, it can make it more nutrient dense. Well, that's what humans have been doing for a very long time. Only ever so recently, within the past 100 years, but really the past 50 years, have we been ultra processing foods. Ultra processed foods, I don't even like to call them foods, but these are foods that have seen more of the inside of a factory, a laboratory, than they have nature. These are foods that you can't recreate in your kitchen, even if you wanted to. It's basically growing a field of wheat, and then you're turning that into Lucky Charms, or you're turning that into Cheerios, something that is unrecognizable to not only the eye, but to your biology as well. And in that process of ultra processing, you're losing so much of the nutritional value that it needs to be added back in through fortified vitamins and minerals. You're literally taking synthetic nutrients and adding it back in to the Cheerios, to what have you, because they're no longer in there because you've processed it so much. Whereas historically, when you fermented foods or you cooked foods, it can actually help to preserve the nutrients or add certain nutrients into it. Through fermenting, for example, you can add B vitamins into it, and it actually makes it more nourishing. Whereas ultra processing is so problematic today that, almost 68 to 70% of our children's diets come from these ultra processed foods. I'm talking snack packs, foods that you just can't recognize. 60% of adults over the age of 18 eat their diet comes from ultra processed foods. So majority of our diet today comes from these ultra processed foods. Whereas 100 years ago, our grandparents that we were just talking about, great grandparents, 0% of their diet came from these ultra processed foods.
0%. And that's the shocking thing. I told this story a little bit ago, but during COVID, when my kids were going sort of to school, I guess, in California, they had, instituted this plan where they would just give out lunches for everybody. We don't know what the situation is at home, so we're just going to give food out. So the government decides, like, hey, we want to do something I think they perceived as well-meaning. And I was like, okay, well, I'm still going to make you lunch, and they hand you this bag at home. Just bring it home. I want to take a look. And so when they brought it home, what they had in it was basically what you just described, all ultra-processed food. The main course of this lunch was a sun butter and jelly Uncrustable, because of course peanuts could set someone off with an allergic reaction. So it's sunflower oil and jelly and this like white bread frankenfood thing. And I'm like, my goodness, this is like terrorizing this child. Why are they giving him this horrible stuff? So that's an example of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And it's not the parents' faults. It's not our faults, because we're just born into this culture, and it's largely a systematic issue that we've just kind of spiraled into this weird culture that we have today. It's beautiful in a lot of ways, but it's also problematic because we have so much availability to these ultra processed foods, and we don't know how to start. And we think maybe healthy foods are more expensive. We can't afford them. They tend to be a little bit more expensive. An avocado is a couple bucks, whereas a cheeseburger from McDonald's is $1. So it might not even be $1 anymore. I don't know if the dollar menu still exists, but it doesn't need to be outrageously expensive. And there's definitely more cost-effective ways to eat healthier. And it just requires just a little bit of knowledge by listening to podcasts like yours and understanding how we can go about doing this.
That's a good call. So maybe throw a couple quick examples of like ultra processed foods out that maybe people think are fine, but aren't.
Yeah, I mean, this could go back to the labels. I mean, like cereal, for instance, it might say low cholesterol or low fat or low sugar, but when you flip over the ingredients, it's just a long list of fortified vitamins and minerals, hybridized wheat and sunflower oil, like seed oils, high fructose corn syrup. That's one example, but then people might get fooled by looking at the front of the label and it says low cholesterol, low fat. But then I mean, basically, you go up and down any of the center aisles in the grocery store. Things that come in boxes or bags are virtually going to be largely processed to a certain extent. Not everything in the center aisles is going to be harmful or bad or quote unquote bad or unhealthy. There's a lot of good options there, but that's just a good telltale sign. Up and down those aisles, that's a more ultra processed place. Whereas if you can shop the perimeter of the grocery store, that's where more of the whole foods are going to be. The vegetables, the fruits, the meats, the dairy items. That's where largely, if you can just shop that perimeter, that's largely going to be more unprocessed or minimally processed foods.
Well, that brings us into the second one of these like 11 dietary principles for the healthiest people on the planet. So that number 2 is the animal-based diet. A lot going on Instagram and TikTok about what this is. What is an animal-based diet? Why is it good for us?
Yeah, so no matter what end of the spectrum on, I eat primarily most of my diet, and like I said before, I've tried experimenting with many different style of quote unquote diets, keto, paleo, the ancestrally aligned diet, things like that. But no matter what whole food diet approach you're eating, whether it's a plant-based or an animal-based diet, which is pretty much the opposite of a plant-based, I see us as on the same team. I think all whole food eaters are on the same team as opposed to people that are advocating for more ultra processed food. So an animal based diet is really just eating a large majority of your calories coming from animal based foods. And in my opinion, that is a healthy diet. And I can talk about the cultures that prioritize this because it's one of the 11 principles that was in that video we were talking about. When people eat a majority of their diet from animal based foods and you're not eating the ultra processed foods, because majority of the time we are eating these animal like burgers with seed oils or the bun or the sodas, the french fries. That's how people are typically eating animal based foods. The red meat, the chicken, it's fried in seed oils. Is it the meat that's unhealthy, or is it all these other things that it's coming along with today? Because you go back 100, 200 years ago, we were eating animal based foods, but it wasn't causing a lot of chronic disease. So an animal based diet is really just eating a good bit of your diet from animal foods, red meat like burgers and steaks, even chicken and pork. And then talk about raw dairy and things like that. Whereas then you're going to also include fruits and the least toxic part of plants. I like fermented foods, and I'm not going to go out there and demonize spinach and kale and all these other whole vegetables, potatoes that you can grow in your garden. For a certain part of the population that might be sensitive to autoimmune issues, sure, maybe those are triggering, but these plants that you can grow in your garden are not causing the chronic health issues, the obesity, the high blood pressure. They're not causing those health issues in our culture today. So really, that's what an animal-based diet is.
So there's been a kind of a shift, for those of us that are like I guess we're less educated in this area. But, I bought the carnivore code, I want to say, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago at this point. Yeah. It's hard to say. Paul Saladino's book, so you had this carnivore movement, and now we're kind of hearing a lot about animal-based diet. Like, I guess, what's the difference and why the shift? Why are we, and maybe that's overly simplistic in your mind. If you want to say that, that's cool too. What do you think?
I mean, in my opinion, I think humans are omnivores. I don't know if that's really debatable at this point. I mean, you can look at any culture historically or even modern day, and you can look at cultures that are kind of still intact with their human roots, if you will. The Hadza, the Maasai, the Yukon Bushmen, all these traditional culture tribes, hunter-gatherer tribes, they will eat plants when they have them, but they learn how to prepare them properly. That's one of these traditional principles that we can talk about. But I think if you go too far in one direction, carnivore or vegan, you start missing out on certain things, and people may experience health benefits in the short term. But after a few years, you really start to realize, like, maybe you function better off carbs. Maybe you function better when you add some of these things back into your diet. And so you go, further up and down the latitude lines. Whereas maybe if you're closer to the equator, these cultures that live closer to the equator are going to add more fruits and vegetables in their diet because they have longer growing seasons. Whereas if maybe you're the Inuits in Alaska back 100 years ago, they lived primarily off of 90%, 95% meat. And it was really just like whale meat and whatever they had there. And the fat, it was like 80% of their diet came from fat and a few berries from time to time. But they were thriving, as well as maybe the Hadza are living closer to the equator and they eat a decent amount of plants as well. So it really depends on where you're from. But what these cultures all over the globe, they didn't have social media, they didn't know each other, but they had all these things in common, is they didn't include ultra processed foods, and they were still including animal-based foods in their diet.
Yeah, so you're telling me that up in Alaska, northern Alaska, they weren't shipping like avocados there, 300 years ago is what you're telling me? That's
No,
shocking.
and that's the crazy thing, is that our perspectives have changed. Is like we have social media and we can see what we're doing, and 100, 300 years ago, 50 years ago, we didn't like know what other cultures were doing unless we saw it on TV or saw it on the newspaper. Now we can see within a split second what's happening on the other side of the world. So it creates this perspective shift, I think.
Yeah, I think you make a good point early on, we're talking about animal-based diets and how, if you're eating whole foods on some level, you're not the quote unquote enemy, right? But you do see, because there is most people eating the standard American diet, it's primarily ultra processed foods, potato chips and French fries and ice cream sandwiches and whatever else, right? And you're getting cheeseburgers from McDonald's, you're getting this like sort of collective all ultra processed food. But there is sort of like a war that goes on between these like vegan folks and these carnivore folks. And there's sort of a going back and forth. Like, here's my raw acai bowl, and then here's my cutting board with meat and eggs and honey on it. And there's this like back and forth. And I don't know what to make of it. It does seem like overall, I guess if you're comparing that to the standard American diet, you're going to do a lot better eating these vegetables if that's all you were eating, supposedly.
Absolutely. And, I think in the short term, whether you're eating carnivore or vegan, like you were mentioning, it's working for them. They're talking about why it's working for them. But I also like to say, don't let your ideology override your biology. And I think what I mean by that, sometimes you can get so full into your beliefs that you just disregard maybe some symptoms that you're experiencing. Maybe you're getting cold often, or maybe your hair is thinning, or maybe you're experiencing skin issues, or maybe you're losing a lot of muscle mass. But you don't want to chalk it up to it being from your diet. And maybe your biology needs certain things that aren't within that dietary framework. And if you prescribe and you're a part of one community, whether that's the carnivore community or paleo community or keto or vegan community, we prescribe to these labels. And, we all need our tribe. We all need to belong somewhere. But if your biology requires something outside of that dietary framework, don't be so full-fledged into your beliefs that you're not open to maybe just trying something outside of that dietary framework, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes great. Yeah, don't let your ideology override your biology, is what I heard. Okay. Yeah, that's good wisdom. Well, let's keep moving. So we got these 11 dietary principles for the healthiest people on the planet. Number 3 was bones and broths. So what you're talking about here is like when you get sick, you get a big Sprite, and you get some chunky soup or whatever, and you get healthy, right?
Campbell's chicken noodle soup or something like that. No. So that's actually just a play. Because humans have been, any culture you look at, it would have been a waste because they didn't know where their next meal was coming from. Our ancestors, in a world of food scarcity, they didn't have the convenience store. They didn't have, the grocery store to go to get their next food. So in a world of food scarcity, it would have been a waste for them to waste any of the animal or any food they came across. So they had to use every part of that animal, whether that was the woolly mammoth or the bison, if it was the early Native Americans. They had to use every part of that animal in order to get calories and nutrients. And almost by accident throughout time, did we come to rely off of some of these nutrients that are specifically in bones and broth. So we would make bone broths, we would boil the bones down and get the collagenous tissues. And the bones and the broth that these cultures all over the globe, like I mentioned before, these cultures didn't know each other, but they had this principle in common. They would all make broths out of bones and vegetables and water and salt. And so what these broths have is different nutrients than you would get in muscle meats like burgers and steak. We're talking about glucosamine, chondroitin, hyaluronic acid, these compounds that are in bone broth that are great for joint health. And the collagen only when it's being cooked for a very long time is it able to break down and then your body's able to digest it. So really, when you look at all these cultures all over the globe throughout history and then in modern day, they have these 11 principles in common. And that's what makes this I don't think there's one diet that's right for everybody, but there are these principles that we can apply that I think can work for virtually everybody.
Yeah, and the bone broth, what an underrated. And there was something to the whole soup thing when you're sick, right? I mean, there is this like immuno, I don't know what's the classic word for it. There's a benefit to your immune system, let's say, I guess, of drinking like bone broth because of the healing properties. I mean, if you're listening, you haven't had like a bone broth, like a proper boil some grass-fed bones or something for a long period of time, and then drink it, you kind of get like a little bit of a buzz or like a little high just from like the taste of that. I mean, it's really good, but it also is like benefiting you. It's making you healthier, which is cool.
Yeah, I think it's really just this sudden influx of nutrients that you're giving your body in such a very bioavailable way. I mean, these nutrients are so absorbable because they don't come with defense chemicals. They're not coming with gluten or lectins or phytates or anything like that that's going to inhibit the nutrients. The first time I tried beef liver, this was back in 2016, 2017. It was this raw beef liver, and I just cut up a chunk and I fed some to my dog, and I did a little shooter. It was like a 2-ounce raw beef liver. This sounds wild if anybody hasn't heard this before, but I just swallowed it with some water, and within 20 minutes, I experienced the biggest buzz. I was like, what is this? So I started looking it up, and because my body wasn't getting these nutrients in, it was this sudden influx of nutrients. And this happens when you start switching to very bioavailable foods, the broths, the animal-based foods, the beef liver. And when you're doing this, I mean, yeah, you're absorbing a lot of these nutrients. Over time, like, you don't experience that because your body's full of these nutrient stores. But yeah, I mean, bones and broth in particular is a very ancestrally consistent way to get in nutrients. It's usually calorically, it's not very calorically dense as ultra processed foods would be, but it's very micronutrient dense. So you're getting not a ton of calories, but you're getting a lot of micronutrients in. So you're able to nourish your body and not overfill yourself up.
Is there something to the idea that collagen is good for your skin? There's like obviously so if you're boiling, you're getting a bone broth, you're going to get a high amount of collagen, but there's also these collagen proteins and such. Your skin's made of collagen, so do these actually work, you think?
Yeah, I mean, collagen is the most abundant protein throughout the human body. Your skin is largely made of collagen, water, some fatty acids. So yeah, I mean, anecdotally, people will say, like, when you take collagen, like, yeah, your hair, your nails grow faster, your skin looks better, but there's definitely a lot of science-backed reasons that collagen consumption can help all these issues, along with maybe joint issues and digestive issues as well.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, number 4. So we talked about cooking food and even eating raw food. I mean, this is a different thing. So if you're talking about, most cultures, aside from maybe like some sushi from Las Vegas that's deep fried with cream cheese, we don't eat a ton of raw food. So maybe you can walk us through that one a bit.
Yeah, and this, I mean, we hear about foodborne illnesses and things. So raw food might be, out there for some people, but historically, cultures have always prioritized consuming both cooked food and raw food. Mm-hmm. And really, in our culture today, when we are trying to have food contained and grown and processed in factories and then trying to ship across state lines and across country lines, this is going to obviously lead to more foodborne illnesses because the quality control goes down. All this happens. But when you are just eating a local diet and you have you're not trying to ship it out to the masses, you're not trying to grow all these foods. If I'm going to my local farm and they are not trying to raise thousands upon thousands of cows, quality control is going to be a lot better there than it is at a factory farm, right? And so when I'm talking about cultures prioritizing cooked food and raw food, this is what I mean, is that when you can source your food locally, the chance of getting foodborne illnesses from raw food, whether that's raw dairy or raw meat, and you're getting it from a local farm, the chance of foodborne illness is going to go way down. Whereas if you're eating raw chicken from Tyson Foods or something like that, where the quality control just isn't there, yeah, the chance of becoming sick with salmonella is probably a lot higher than if you were getting it from your local farm. And the data is there to support that. But the reason that cultures both ate cooked food and some raw foods, and this is true throughout different cultures throughout the globe, is that when you cook food, it pre-digests it, so we're able to absorb the nutrients a lot better in cooked food. I mean, you can digest when you cook a potato, like eating a raw potato is a lot harder to digest than if you were to actually cook that potato. It softens it up and you're able to digest the calories a little bit more. The same thing goes with meat and virtually any other cooked food you can think of. But we've also consumed some foods raw. I mean, if you've ever seen, this is a movie, but if you've ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, when Kevin Costner, he's out on a hunt with the Native Americans and they grab, I don't know if it's the beef heart or the beef liver, but they take a bite out of it raw. And that's just what cultures have done. It sounds wild to us, I know, but the reason they did that was because, one, I believe there was probably some spiritual reasons to it, but they knew that if you did that, that would give you a lot of life, that would give you a lot of nutrients than if you were to cook some of those nutrients out of it, because heating destroys vitamin C, heating destroys some B vitamins. So if you can eat some foods raw, as long as they are very safe and grown properly and processed properly, it's going to give you a lot more nutritional value. So that's the reason that cultures have done that.
And you've done some of the raw liver then, right?
Yeah, I don't do it as much as I have before, but I would do a few ounces a day of raw liver and just throw it back with some water. And I've never had an issue with it because I knew my sourcing. So it's not as wild as you might think.
Well, I think the first time I did a raw liver, I just was like experimenting. This is maybe 10 years ago. I was like, oh, how do I make this like when it's raw? Because everyone's saying eat it. So I just put it in a blender and tried to drink it, and it was literally the most disgusting thing I've ever eaten. But so then I heard what you could do is you could actually put them like in like an ice tray and freeze them, and then you could like swallow them like capsules. So I started doing that for a while, and I was like, oh, then I'll have to taste it, and you still get like some of those benefits. But you could also just cook it or take a supplement.
You can, you can cook it, which does remove some of the nutrients, but eating cooked liver is still better than taking no liver, in my opinion. And definitely, I think taking a desiccated or freeze-dried beef liver supplement is the next best thing. So that's just a great way to get it into.
And Ancestral Supplements has all sorts of different organ supplements as well that people use. It's not just liver, but also like heart and spleen and all these other things.
Virtually every organ or glandular, thyroid, pancreas, spleen, kidney, and it's all freeze-dried, so it preserves most of the nutrients. So that way you can take a capsule, can't really taste it, or we have protein powders mixed with medicinal mushrooms and bone broth and some sea salt in there, so it tastes pretty good, vanilla or chocolate. You're getting in the beef organs, but you don't have to taste it. So it's just an easier way to get it in.
I've heard it said, some of these the organs from a grass-fed cow are perhaps one of the most nutritionally dense foods in the entire planet. Do you agree, disagree with that statement?
I do. And I think, bison are probably more nutrient dense. They're they're a bigger animal. But a cow for sure, I think that's just common in our culture today. Cows, a couple hundred years ago, we had 60 million bison roaming the Great Plains of North America. But I would argue that organ meats from ruminant animals, a cow, a bison, are the most nutrient dense foods on the planet. When you look at the nutrients they contain and do they have defense chemicals, are they gonna, when we're talking about plants like kale, that might have a lot of vitamin A, but it might not be coming in the most bioavailable form. It might be coming in the form beta carotene, whereas vitamin A from beef liver is going to be in the form retinol. Your body can absorb that form from beef liver better than it can from plant sources.
That's really good, because I do know sometimes vegan diets, they have some nutritional shortcomings, and so they'll opt to supplement alongside some of the B vitamins or whatever it is, and yet some of those might not be as bioavailable as getting it right from the source, like you're talking about some of these organ meats.
Yeah, I think if anybody is going to prescribe to a plant-based, primarily vegetarian or vegan diet, definitely look to consuming, some essential nutrients that you can't necessarily get on that diet. Vitamin B12, zinc is another one because it's not very bioavailable. Heme iron, a lot of these nutrients that you can kind of pick out and point, they're not very bioavailable. So you want to make sure you're supplementing with a high-quality supplement, or just eat some beef liver, and that's it there.
Yeah, you could just solve it by eating raw liver right out of the animal after you shoot it with your bow and arrow.
There you
Why
go.
not? Okay, number 5, fermented foods.
Mm-hmm.
This one, some Americans maybe go as far as like, your traditional like pull it out of the grocery store sour cream when it comes to fermented food.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they go too much farther, unless they're maybe like in Chicago and they're throwing some like sauerkraut on a hot dog. Like, tell me about fermented foods.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, my perception of fermented foods growing up was really just on New Year's Day. You'd have the pork and sauerkraut. I didn't know where sauerkraut came from. I didn't know it came from cabbage, but my dad would actually make sauerkraut. We would, when I got older into my teenage years, we would get a bunch of cabbage and shred it up and take a mallet and pound it down inside a big old basin, sprinkle it with some salt, cover it, and 8 weeks later you had sauerkraut. That was the simplest way to do it. Well, cultures throughout time, again, these principles throughout time, cultures would ferment foods because it made them, like I talked about earlier, more bioavailable. The nutrients were more bioavailable. It reduced the defense chemicals and it made the food safer to consume. When we talk about the history of bread, for instance, when we hear about bread in the Bible, do you know what kind of bread that was?
Let's hear it.
It was sourdough bread. It wasn't your typical
Delicious.
It wasn't your just typical whole wheat bread that you're going to get in the grocery store. By default, all bread throughout time was sourdough because cultures knew that we had to ferment the grains outside of our bodies because we can't digest that internally. We don't have the proper digestive mechanisms to ferment inside of our bodies like a ruminant animal, a cow would. They have 4 stomachs, regurgitates it back up, and they ferment it. So humans have learned throughout time to ferment their food externally. Well, within the past 50 to 100 years, companies have learned to bypass that fermentation process for the sake of convenience, profit, just hitting their bottom line, and it's removed a lot of the health benefits. So cultures have done this. They've fermented these foods, whether that's grains or cabbage or these other foods. We're talking kimchi, sauerkraut, even dairy. They would ferment raw milk into kefir. It would make it a tart, kind of tangy, drinkable yogurt. But they did that kind of just out of necessity to make the food safer, and it made it more probiotic rich. Any food that's fermented has a good deal of probiotics. It makes the food safer. It reduces the acidic load. So pathogenic bacteria can't survive in that environment. So any fermented food that you can think of is really going to be safer. It's going to have more enzymes. It's going to be easier to digest. It's going to give your body probiotics. And cultures have known this for a very long time. So fermented foods, I think, should make a staple of virtually everyone's diet.
Yeah, people didn't have, it's not shocking to say, people didn't have like freezers and refrigerators throughout history. So they had to, especially talking about in the Bible times, if you wanted your food to last and you perhaps didn't know where your next meal was coming from, presumably it would be more helpful to have fermented foods that would help you. And I mean, wine for a long time, I guess, is kind of a sidebar, but people would drink, wine was fermented and water wasn't always plentiful and it certainly wasn't always safe to drink. But if you had fermented drink, you could at least have something to drink.
Yeah, I recently had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Bill Schindler, who's an expert on all things anthropology and human history. And are you familiar with him?
I've seen some of his stuff. Yeah.
He's got a lot of good stuff. And he was telling me that throughout virtually all of time, like when alcohol was invented, all alcohol was a cider because of the way it was fermented. Not the typical ciders that we have today that are full of additives, preservatives, and stuff like that. But I asked him, I was like, did alcohol have health benefits to it then? The ciders? And he's like, I wouldn't go as far as saying that, but it did have probiotics and it was better for us, not as bad as typical alcohol today.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to go back and watch that episode. Maybe I'll put a link in the show notes for folks if they want to go dive into it, because it's a really interesting concept and subject when you start thinking about this. We were sort of lost in our culture and we just don't understand, and we're kind of forgotten that people had to eat differently and they actually could have been perhaps more healthy back then in many different ways, at least in regards to their eating, than we are now. Yeah. All right, so number 6, healthy fats. Now, so this isn't as controversial as it was maybe 10 years ago, but we were told, fat is bad, it gives you diabetes. But I mean, I grew up reading bodybuilding.com and trying to get huge for football and basketball and track and all this stuff. And I was told that the phrase that was all over the websites was, if you eat fat, you're going to get fat. And it was just like, okay, done. But you're saying healthy fats were a good thing for these cultures.
They're a great thing, and cultures have prioritized sourcing out fats. I mean, when you look at the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, he found the healthiest cultures all over the world that stayed intact with their roots. They were prioritizing fat from any source that they could get it. And they didn't have seed oils because seed oils are very ultra processed form of fats. They're not fats, they're oils. But yeah, I mean, cultures were prizing fats because they're very calorically dense, but they were full of fat soluble vitamins like vitamins A, D, E, and K2. And I think the reasoning that we think that fat might make us fat is one, the name itself. If you're eating fat, it's going to be the same fat on our bodies. Biochemistry doesn't work that way. We should probably call the fat that we're eating, whether that's, fat from dairy or tallow or ghee or olive oil. I like to maybe call that energy because your body can use that for energy if you're in a healthy metabolically active state. But these fats that we've eaten throughout history are completely different than the fats and oils that we're eating today. And the fats and oils that we're eating today, we're talking 80% of our fat calories come from seed oils. These are industrially processed grain and seed oils: sunflower, soybean, safflower, canola oil, cottonseed, grapeseed, peanut oils. These are foods, like I mentioned at the beginning, not even foods. These are oils that you couldn't get by making them in your kitchen. You have to it requires multi-million-dollar machinery just to take these grains and seeds and process them into and somewhat edible oil. And so we can kind of stop there, and then we can talk about maybe the science behind why they're not the best.
Yeah, that sounds disgusting. Yeah, I mean, you've read, there's a lot of great books on it. The one that just came out recently is the Dark Calories book by Dr. Kate Shanahan. Yeah, great book. But yeah, it describes it in great detail. It's pretty disgusting, especially when you consider, the bleaching and then the hexane and all some of the insane amounts of hoops they have to jump through just to turn that stuff into something that looks sort of edible. And the fact that they have to dye it so it like has a color to it, so you make your brain think, oh, this must be from a plant because it's not clear.
I mean, just the name vegetable oil, that's a marketing term that I don't know how that came to be in the early 1900s or mid 1900s, but that's a term that says like, oh, vegetable oil, that's got to be healthy, right? But they're not vegetable oils. They're grain and seed oils, and they're full of polyunsaturated fats. And so without going too deep into biochemistry, we have saturated fats, which we're told are, the devil, they're the demon. We don't like those. They will clog your arteries, cause heart disease. And a lot of conventional health experts will say that that's what caused the death of my uncle because he was eating too many saturated fats. We can kind of break that down, but there's polyunsaturated fats, there's saturated fats, there's monounsaturated fats, there's trans fats, which we know are bad for us because those are man-made. But polyunsaturated, poly just means many. So really there's many double bonds inside that carbon chain length. So there's more room for oxidation. Oxidation, you can think of like metal rusting. So if you're eating a lot of polyunsaturated fats coming mostly from seed oils, that's causing a lot of oxidation inside of your arteries. And this can lead to a lot of different things. Oxidized LDL. Your LDL might go down, but it can cause a lot of inflammation and oxidation of that cholesterol inside your body. So that's a reasoning why there was a study done by UC Davis researchers in 2010 or 2011. Over 137,000 patients hospitalized with a heart attack. 75% of them had healthy, quote unquote, healthy and low normal levels of LDL. How can high LDL cholesterol be a problem or the causative factor of heart attacks, heart disease, if 75% of them had healthy levels of LDL? It's because probably they had a lot of inflammation, oxidation in there that wasn't addressed. And they were probably eating, seed oils, maybe smoking, and doing lifestyle factors that cause this underlying oxidative stress.
Yeah, and stuff that we sort of have been, I don't want to. We're all sort of in charge of our own health to a certain degree, but with the government says, for years, hey, these are the things that are healthy for you. There's marketers involved, and you're kind of just going along with it. Maybe you're not paying as much of attention. there are, to a certain degree, you are kind of relying on some of these institutions to inform you. That's why I always say, hey, you got to take charge of your own health. You can't outsource that to the government. You can't outsource that to your 6th grade science class.
Absolutely. And to kind of wrap up that point with the types of fats that we eat, saturated fats coming from animal fats and butter and lard and ghee and those sorts of fats, those are more saturated. They're going to be solid at room temperature. They're saturated with hydrogen atoms. They don't have room for a lot of oxidation to occur. So when you're eating those are very stable inside the body. And your skin, half of it is made out of half the fat in your skin is made out of saturated fats and monounsaturated fats. Not a lot of it is made out of polyunsaturated fats. So when you're eating a lot of seed oils that are full of polyunsaturated fats, you're making your skin out of these things. You're making your organs, your tissues, your cells out of these. And you can see a lot of issues start to happen. And this is well documented in the scientific literature. Cut out seed oils for 30 to 60 days and replace that with more saturated and monounsaturated fats, like a high quality extra virgin olive oil, a good quality coconut oil, tallow, butter, ghee, and you will start to see some differences as long as you're living a otherwise healthy lifestyle.
Wow. Great information there, Craig. That's fantastic. What you were talking about brought it to mind just because, again, that bodybuilding thing, you eat fat, you're going to get fat. You sort of have this idea that, okay, well, I got to eat the chicken breast and I've got to eat the lean cuts of beef. And if I do that, then I'm healthy. But then if you look at nature, I mean, maybe you've heard of high grading with bears, where bears will, especially in the Northwest, when salmon's plentiful out here, and even north in Alaska, they'll eat the skin and the brain and the eggs of the salmon and kind of discard the rest. So they're getting that nutritionally dense portion of the fish.
Yeah, that's the same with most cultures. I mean, most species, carnivore or omnivorous species, they go for the organs. They go for those most nutrient-dense parts of the animal first. Organs, brain, eggs, fat is the most nutrient-dense part. And the fat is not going to cause the fat. If you're overeating a ton of calories, yeah, you can store fat, but just eating fat by itself, it's not going to spike blood sugar. It's not going to spike insulin levels. It's the most satiating macronutrient right next to protein. These things are not going to spike your blood sugar, which is going to keep your blood sugar stable. Biomechanically speaking, like it's not going to cause body fat storage.
That's
Sugar,
great.
processed carbs, things like that are really what's going to, spike your blood sugar and cause fat promotion.
So good. Well, going along with this one, number 7, the optimal omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Now that's something that feels a little more advanced. What's the difference between these two? How can we balance the ratio out?
Yeah, so kind of just tying in that topic about polyunsaturated fats, there's under the umbrella of polyunsaturated fats, we have omega-6s and omega-3s. People might have heard about these omega-3s in terms of fish oil or something like that, whereas omega-6s are pretty predominant in seed oils. Well, there was research done throughout the past 100 years that looked at these traditional cultures, and they had an ideal ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, about a 1-to-1, maybe even as high as a 4-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. Today, in our modern world, Americans have as high as maybe 30-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. And the problem with this, omega-6s are more inflammatory. Omega-3s are more anti-inflammatory. And so when we're eating more of these inflammatory fatty acids like omega-6s from seed oils, and we're not getting in enough omega-3s from healthy sources like fish and even red meat will have some, then that can skew inflammation levels. So we need to go back to eating more ancestrally consistent amounts of omega-6s and omega-3s. The easiest way to do that, cut out seed oils and eat more omega-3 rich foods like fish and even red meat.
Great wisdom on that one. Okay, so the next one, number 8, healthy cultures prepare their food traditionally.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
This goes back to kind of fermented foods. I mean, cultures have long known that you can't just go and really just start eating a lot of different plants. And this really kind of addresses maybe mostly plant foods in particular, because plants do contain defense chemicals. We're talking gluten, which is a lectin, phytates or phytic acid, oxalates. You can look at oxalates underneath a microscope. This is prevalent in spinach and other leafy greens. and it looks like little shards of glass. And oxalates, you might have heard of, kidney
Yikes.
stones or something like that,
Oh, for sure.
can build up. But cultures have known this throughout time, that these foods may harm you if you eat them too much in excess. You can put like a ton of spinach in a smoothie, and we've heard reports about, famous people doing this and getting kidney stones or causing a lot of oxalate issues because of this. Well, cultures never would have done that. They wouldn't have put a ton of spinach in their smoothie. I used to do this for years, but if certain people that are predisposed to autoimmune issues, this can cause certain issues. Well, traditional food preparation would be fermenting those or cooking those or just preparing your plants properly. I wouldn't go out there and just start eating a raw plant food based diet for these reasons. Cultures never would have done that throughout time and in modern day. Whereas they would ferment their foods, they would soak their beans, they would sprout their beans or seeds. This is a way to make the foods more bioavailable, easier to digest, because again, we don't have that digestive system that can really break down those foods. We did this externally. So if we are going to eat plant-rich foods, a predominantly portion of them in our diets, I would go out there and look, how can we traditionally prepare those through soaking, sprouting, and fermenting?
That's good wisdom. Yeah, I read somewhere that like feeling after you eat spinach on your teeth where it's all like,
Yeah.
Weird. That's like those oxalates, correct? So
Yeah.
like, those are the oxalates all over your teeth. Is that true? I mean, I got it
I'm
from
under
a good
that
source.
impression. Yeah, I'm under that impression. It might be like the cellulose of the plant fiber that we can't really break down, but it's definitely full of oxalates. And cooking might remove some of it, like heating it in a pan. You take a big bag of spinach, and then somehow it becomes, the size of, like a fistful. It like shrinks down. That might remove some oxalates, but still, you're really going to need to maybe pressure cook it. Pressure cooking your potatoes or your beans can remove more of those lectins and oxalates, but it's hard to say. And people that are more sensitive to these issues, that have autoimmune issues, skin issues, digestive issues like IBS, might not be able to handle them as well. And you might need to go the extra length of soaking, sprouting, or fermenting these plant foods.
Is there anything you can get? You can get out of spinach that you can't get out of an animal-based, like an organ or a meat?
No, this is funny because I did a video a few months back comparing healthy ice cream to spinach and broccoli, and I got a lot of pushback on this. And I compared the nutrients in a good, healthy, raw dairy ice cream. It was just raw cream, it was raw milk, it was honey, and I think there was egg yolks in there as well. It was like 4 or 5 ingredients.
Sounds great.
It was really good. Yeah, it's delicious. I make it often. But when I compared the nutrients, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K, vitamin C, and then we go down the list of like choline and B vitamins, nearly all of them were substantially higher and more bioavailable in the ice cream than it was in broccoli or spinach. So there's really nothing other than maybe fiber. And fiber, I do think, plays an important role in the human diet to a certain extent, but that's a topic for another day. But really, I mean, when we're just talking about nutrient density, vitamins and minerals, yeah, the animal foods are always going to be more bioavailable than you're going to get in plant foods.
That's what I suspected. There's no need for me to have any spinach then. I'm good. I'm good on that one. Okay. Eat more salt.
Yeah. So do you know where the word salary comes from?
I have a hunch now that you've said it.
I'm sorry. Salt. Where the word salt comes from.
Oh, okay.
It comes from the Latin word of salary, or I think it's salar, something like that. But yeah, salt was actually used as a form of currency throughout time and in different cultures because it was that important. Yeah, because we need salt in our diet. And I'm not talking about the little umbrella girl of iodized, table salt. That's not real salt. We're talking about, unprocessed salt that has seen minimal pollution in our culture, but cultures have needed salt in their diet. I mean, there was a study, and I have it right here, that found that our current recommendations are to keep sodium under, I think it's 2,300 milligrams per day to prevent hypertension, to prevent some of these chronic health issues. Well, this study found that, and this was a very large scale study, that when you restrict salt under 3 milligrams a day, and our current recommendations are 2,300, you start to see more cardiovascular issues. And then when you scale that up to maybe over 6 to 7 grams a day, you see cardiovascular issues. The sweet spot of salt consumption, sodium consumption, is between 3 and 6 to 7 grams per person every single day. And that would fly in the face of what we are learning here, what I learned at my conventional university. Eat under 2,300 milligrams of salt. The problem is, where we're eating salt today is typically on fast food, French fries, these ultra processed foods. But if you're eating a whole food based diet, you kind of need to salt your food a little bit because we need sodium in our diet. And we're going to be getting more magnesium. We're going to be getting more potassium from these whole foods. So to kind of balance those out, you need to salt your food a little bit more, especially if you're an athlete, if you're sweating a little bit. I sweat a lot. I need more salt in my diet. So I don't technically count how much salt I'm getting, but I just generously salt my meals that I'm cooking. And I might take some electrolyte supplements that have sodium in it. But really that sweet spot for most people is between that 3 and 6 to 7 grams per day of sodium.
I thought it was interesting how they started, these electrolyte supplements with sodium became real popular when the ketogenic diet was getting more popular. People were eating less processed foods, and maybe some of these athletes cramping a little bit more than they were probably thinking because they're not drinking the Gatorade and eating the junk. But yeah, there was a need for salt, even on a diet like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when you're cutting out carbs, you might know this if you've been following any bodybuilder style work. When you cut out the carbs, you're losing a lot of water weight. And what happens when you lose a lot of water weight? You're losing a lot of these electrolytes too. So that's the reason for a ketogenic style diet. You're eating primarily protein and fat. You're not eating a ton of carbs. So you're not holding on to a lot of water weight, which means you're not holding on to a lot of these electrolytes as well. So you need to add more electrolytes, sodium, potassium, magnesium into your diet.
Come on. That's good. All right. Well, number 10 is eat nutrient-dense foods. I feel like throughout this episode, we got that. You think we're good on that one?
Yeah, it's really just prioritize eating nutrient density, and that's really just making sure you're getting more fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K2 into your diet, and that's going to come through the diets that we just talked about.
Cool. All right. Last one I think is very important. I should say kind of fertility boosting foods.
Yeah.
So if we need to eat more fertility boosting foods, I guess my natural hunch is, are we promoting currently infertility foods? Is that what we're doing?
Yeah, infertility, what is it like? It affects 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 Americans.
Very high.
Today. It's super high. And historically, that shouldn't happen. I mean, there's so much that we could talk about with this, but cultures throughout time, they would set aside certain foods, whether that's beef liver or egg yolks. They would set aside even raw dairy. Cultures, and again, they didn't know each other. They didn't have social media. They didn't know what each culture was doing, but they all had this in common. And they were setting aside certain foods just for the expecting mother or father or women that wanted to get pregnant. Or they would wait until the time of the year when the cows were producing more nutrient-dense milk in the spring when they were eating the fresh grass. So they were particularly focused on how to produce healthy, not just healthy egg quality in women, but also healthy sperm quality in men. So that way they could boost fertility. And that's really what our species is about, is just trying to extend our species to the next generation. And when I started diving into this a little bit more by talking to other experts on this and learning about this, because my wife and I are pregnant with our first child who's due in a few months, I was learning so much about this, and it just made so much sense that the easiest way that I can explain this is that for both the mother and the father that want to get pregnant, you need to send signs of abundance to your body. Your biology does not want to bring a child into this world if it thinks you are living in a scarcity environment, whether you're stressed out, exposed to a lot of environmental toxins, you're eating a nutrient poor diet, you're not getting enough sleep. Your biology is not going to want to bring a baby into this world if that is your reality. Whereas if you are eating nutrient dense foods, the foods that we've been talking about, the beef liver, the egg yolks, the dairy, even the fermented plant foods, all of these nutrients, if you're eating those foods, you're not only going to have healthier eggs and healthier sperm, as the data shows, but you're going to be sending signs of abundance to your body that it's okay to bring a child into this world. So with infertility rates on the rise affecting, I believe it's 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 couples nowadays, it might be higher than that. Prioritizing this whole food based approach and applying these 11 principles can really help with that.
I think it was 2014 when Dave Asprey, who was like the bulletproof guy, he came out with like an ice cream recipe at home to make called the Get Some ice cream. It's basically what you just described for your ice cream, except there was just like an insane amount of egg yolks in it with some like MCT oil and like cream, grass-fed from grass-fed cows. And his whole premise back then was like, if you eat, try to eat this, if you're having issues with fertility, and see if your wife can get pregnant or whatever. And well, I gave that to a friend of ours who was struggling, and she never gave me credit, but she was struggling for a long time. But she did get pregnant at like a week or two after they started eating that. So I can't confirm nor deny that was it, but I have my suspicions that we helped.
I love that. And I've heard stories similar to that, throughout time. And it's crazy when you give your body these nutrients. And not only the anecdotal, but the science just backs that up. I mean, over 90% of women are deficient in choline. And if you're not eating eggs, that number jumps up to over 95 or 99% of women are deficient in choline. And for those that don't know, choline was really just discovered in the 1990s. It's a relatively new nutrient that is very similar to B vitamins. But choline is particularly beneficial for brain function, but also for egg quality and sperm health in the men. And so if you're not getting this nutrient in, it can lead to infertility rates, miscarriages, and other issues like that. And so if you're not eating egg yolks, which are a very predominant source of choline, probably one of the reasons why egg yolks are in that Get Some ice cream. But yeah, I mean, these are the most nutrient dense foods that we can be eating that really help with fertility.
Craig, we just went through these 11 points. You couldn't possibly give us any more information, but I just have to ask. We laid these out, these 11 dietary principles for the healthiest people on the planet over the course of history. Any last words, any last advice for anybody kind of listening, going, all right, like maybe I'm ready to take the plunge?
This was maybe overwhelming if this is new to you and you're first hearing this, but just have grace with yourself. Be patient. Take it one day at a time. The things that I've applied, and I'm sure you have, Eddie, it didn't all happen at once. It didn't happen overnight. You live and you learn, and you do this over the span of years, and you take one step at a time, and you just make changes and you experiment. Just have grace with yourself and just take it one day at a time is my advice.
That's good. Be patient. Hey, one baby step is a baby step towards better wellness, better longevity, better well-being, better performance. And so, yeah, be kind to yourself. I think that's great advice. Craig, where can people hear more about you, more about ancestral supplements, Instagram, YouTube, all that stuff?
Yeah, so I'm available on Instagram at Craig_McCloskey. I'm also active on the Ancestral Supplements Instagram as well, put out a lot of content there. And like you mentioned earlier, I host the Ancestral Wisdom on our YouTube at Ancestral Wisdom Show. I'm available pretty much wherever.
I have to recommend, just as a side, that YouTube channel. If like Ex Nihilo podcast is at all beneficial to you, you will greatly benefit from subscribing. So I'm gonna throw the links to all that stuff down in the show notes on YouTube and on your pod provider. Craig, thanks for jumping on with me. This was fun, man.
Thanks, Eddie.